we have two scholars with us who are superstars. Tanya Willard, who is a scholar of Secwépemc and settler heritage. She's assistant professor of creative studies and visual arts. She is at the University of British Columbia. She's an artist, a poet, a curator. She specializes in Indigenous languages, visual art, relational aesthetics, and socially engaged practice. With a master in fine arts, her work demonstrates the shifting ideas between Indigenous knowledges and cultural current art practices, between traditional and the contemporary, between an aesthetic of portrayal of land rights and environmental consciousness. And it is a real privilege to have her with us today. And this is original, future-looking work that she's doing. And we're so proud of it. And Chantelle Richmond has her PhD from McGill. She's a professor at Western University, and she's a member of the Biigtigong Nishnaabeg Bear Clan. She's an associate professor of geography, but she is in charge of the Interdisciplinary Development Initiative in Applied Indigenous Scholarship. And when we talk about the future of research, we often say it's at that interdisciplinary cross that things will happen. And she truly is at that crossroads between geography, the place that people are, the identification and meaning of that place in their lives as their lives are affected by the environment, and traditional cultural practices. Having studied how health and diet are important to local populations, she's actually studied with colleagues around the world in Hawaii and New Zealand to use her knowledge globally. So Chantelle, we are so pleased to welcome you. And you have been brave beyond my possible way of conceiving things in defining what kind of research you can do and how you can make that research real for people, such as canoeing down the Pic River and reclaiming and naming all of the places. That is brave and lovely. Mr. Martin, I know you want to kick off the conversation with some questions. So please consider me the spectator and carry on.
Well, thank you very much, Roseann. You described me earlier as the future. Let me tell you, it's been a long time since anybody has described me as the future. But I have the honor really to introduce the two people who are going to be who are the future. That's Tanya and Chantelle. Tanya and Chantelle, as scholars, at the beginning of your careers, can you share with us and with those who are listening the words that might encourage young people to follow in your footsteps? You're both extraordinary role models. And the question really is, how can we motivate the next generation of scholars, researchers, and artists to emulate you? Over to you, Tanya, and then to Chantelle.
Great. Well, thank you so much. White Whiteip, Resquest Tanya Willard, Slaka Klilaweka, Nisgain Esh, Secwépemc Utluch. I just want to greet you in my language of Secwépemc Nation, and I'm so happy to be here today. And yeah, I think all of us perhaps at this point think, well, I think of the future as my children as opposed to myself, but thank you for all the kind words and the introduction. I think being here today, this kind of representation matters. I think for myself, if I think back to my undergraduate degree, it mattered to me that Métis filmmaker and professor Christine Welsh taught a women's studies course. This was the first time I had an Indigenous instructor in my entire life, in my entire educational experience. And it mattered to me to see her in that position. And I hope it matters today for young people, young Indigenous people, to see Chantelle and myself here today, because it opens up possibility. It opens up possibility to see ourselves Writer Richard Van Camp, who I'm a great admirer of, also talked about this idea of permission, and seeing somebody and having a representation gives us permission to dream and to act and to set goals to become what we see, the kind of representation. But I want to add to that and say that scholars in my life, though not represented in educational institutions, were represented in my family. You know, the scholarly work that they have done in education, in activities and harvesting from the land and maintaining tradition are as valid scholarly activity as my work in the institution. So I think I have, you know, amazing mentors and family who were there, who were representing themselves as Secwépemc people or as Canadians. I do come from a mixed background of Secwépemc and settler ancestry. And that modeling of the possibility and how knowledge can be carried in such varied ways, I think leads me to where I am today. So thank you for that question.
Well, thank you, Tanya. And Chantelle?
Okay. Well, bonjour. Ani dieses Quedishnakas, Makododem, Biigtigong Nishnaabeg, and Dunjaba. My name is Chantelle, and I'm so happy to be here. Thank you very much for that really welcoming opening. Roseann, those were beautiful words. I'm so happy to be here with Tanya today, and I have to say that I 100% agree with this idea of representation and creating these structures that open the space for more diversity in science and in the arts and in social science research. And I think, you know, as Tanya was speaking, I was reminded of the fact that like 20 years ago, when I did my PhD at McGill, there wasn't a single Indigenous faculty member there. And that was not very long ago. The Canadian Institutes for Health Research has only been, you know, ongoing since 2003. And at that time, there was an inaugural scientific director, Jeff Redding, who led the establishment of the Institute for Aboriginal People's Health. And that was a really brave and a really important step forward for identifying that we needed to create an institute that would embrace Indigenous knowledges, that would support Indigenous leadership around research, and that it would create places that would embrace Indigenous ways of knowing about our own matters. And so, you know, as we try to seek solutions to our most pressing matters, right, thinking about chronic disease, food insecurity, ongoing water struggles, and so on, that we can begin to build the base of knowledge from our own people. And I think this is so important because it creates the structures for success, because Indigenous peoples have been structurally disempowered for a very long time. I think the other really key thing that has happened in the past, you know, 25 years is that we're seeing the embracing of Indigenous people and Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing that embrace nature, that embrace family, that are super relational and allow for ways of expertise and ways of knowing that take us outside of the university. And so that, you know, as we're trying to create solutions and create a new base of science, and I shouldn't say it's a new base of science because it's a really old way of knowing, right? Because we're doing research that is founded in our families, in our ways of knowing that have existed for a really long time. It's just that they are now being brought into the spotlight and recognized as valid. And so I think that has been very exciting for me, and to be, I'd say, validated in this way of doing research by Tri-Council, by my university, and being among this new wave of scholars who are doing this work has just been so empowering. And I think it's really, you know, as Tanya said, like it's within us, and it's that's what makes it so special. So I'm really excited about what's happening in this time in Indigenous research.
Well, look, that's really tremendous. And there is no doubt that the CFI represents the future, and you two represent the future. You too, Roseann. And so here I am desperately trying to catch up. I'm going to ask you a series of questions. The first one is really health, mental health, and community health are central issues in both of your careers, Chantelle and Tanya. So Tanya, you've been quoted as saying, in recognition of historical traumas, that opening up those spaces for those conversations and for that awareness can be healing. So I'd ask you really, can you elaborate on the relationship among land and culture, health and the environment from your perspective? And then I'm coming to you, Chantelle, after.
Perfect. Thank you for that question. I am trying to remember when that quote may be from, because I think that though it is still important to open up conversation and dialogue to address these kinds of issues, both within our communities and with outside communities, the time for that, I think, has started to pass. And we're in this time now where there's enough of a plan, a roadmap for us from things like the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, going back to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. We have the Missing and Murdered Women's Inquiry, and all of the voices of all of the people who have been brave and courageous to defend their culture, their land, their ways of being. We have enough of those voices now that we should be able to see the path and start to take action to travel that path. And I think that's where I see us today. Sometimes we're still in this time of truth telling, of conversation, but I think that really importantly, we need to start to take action today. We need to start to follow some of those recommendations, and we need to be really active about pushing for change. Because we need to act now, we need to put those plans in place that take us from talk to resourced solutions and implementation and sustaining the strategies for those policies. So, this isn't a project here, a project there. These are really sustained ways to follow those recommendations, to follow the voices of those who have, stood up and said, this is harming my community, this is harming my culture, this is harming my family, and by extension, all of us are in the same boat when those kinds of harms are perpetuated, that we need to now start to alter the systems around us in order to move forward. And I think we are doing that. I see that exactly in the work of Indigenous researchers and scholars, in the work of settler allies who are really pushing for on the ground change to fundamentally restructure the conversation. So we need to share with each other in order to heal, but we need to also change in order to maintain that health. And though my work touches on these issues, it really does so from an artist perspective. So I want to be careful here to not, give myself any credentials. My perspective on health comes from being, a community member, being active in my community and other kinds of communities, and really seeing the healing that artistic and creative expression can bring, because it's been a really important place for people when they feel displaced or they feel hurt in different ways, to be able to exercise that through expressive ways of making and being. I have seen in work with this youth, as an Indigenous youth, I've seen this heal, I've seen this change people, the ability to express themselves. So that's part of my commitment to artistic and creative practice, and seeing that in a holistic way as improving conditions on an individual basis, and then by extension, community and larger public basis. Thank you.
Well, that's very well said, Tanya. And Chantelle, now over to you. As the director of an Indigenous health lab, you know this area quite well. How do you envisage the bringing together of traditional knowledge and contemporary healthcare practices? How do you envisage bringing together the community and researchers and the disparities in health in Canada and the world? That's a very big question. So over to you.
Well, thank you for the question. And you're right, it is very big. I think that the most important role that I play is like I'm a relationship builder. I've, often see myself as a person who sadly has had to learn to live in and survive in two different places. And I've written quite a bit about this, about how for a long time, I had to really be mindful of who I was presenting myself to be, depending on what environment I was in. And so for a long time, that meant, presenting my Indigenous self when it was safe to, and guarding myself very carefully and presenting my non-Native self in other places. And, that's like a heavy burden to have to shoulder. And I think that the changes that we're starting to see, the awakening that's happening in universities, and all of the great work that Tanya cited, the reports and the work that our communities are doing to bring light to bring light and attention to the fact that colonial policies, processes of dispossession, structural disempowerment, this stuff is still happening. And it's really awful, I think, that Indigenous students, Indigenous people have to guard themselves when they come into institutions. And so my role as someone who's been there and has been able to successfully navigate it and to earn a Canada Research Chair, to kind of learn how to navigate these systems to my advantage means that, I'm capable of bringing others in. And I never want to bring students or communities into places when I know that it's not safe for them to be there. And so what we have done is we've kind of started to create spaces that are safe, right? And so that means that we're working really hard to bring more Indigenous hires into the university, that we're creating spaces that represent Indigenous voices, Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous foods and languages, and so on. And a lot of that work happens inside the walls of the university, but most of it happens outside. And so that means, I think, we have to be, paying attention to the ways that we do research on the land. And in that case, this is where I think that relational piece is happening, because not everybody is capable of engaging in that work. I think the relational piece means I'm working very hard to bring students in, train them in a good way, but also we're trying to break down boundaries so that we can make, I think, university research spaces places that are really good and that are meeting the needs of communities, so that we don't have to just be doing the work out there, but that we can do it safely in these places, so that we have, say, medicine gardens on campus, and other places where people can fully be who they need to be, and they don't have to remove pieces of themselves, right? And so I think that there are particular places and times and roles, and our allied scholars play a really important role in doing that work. And I think that funding organizations like CFI, like the Tri-Council, for example, are really paying attention. And this, I think, is a very important structural change that is happening to, lessen the systemic burden that Tanya was talking about earlier. I hope that helps a little. Thank you.
It does. It helps a lot. So I have a question really for both of you. the relationship between humankind, between humanity and the land and water is of extreme importance to Indigenous people. We understand that, and the tremendous insight that the Indigenous people have in terms of land and water. I first noticed this over 60 to 70 years ago when I had a summer job as a university student, so it'd be 60 years ago, a summer job working as a deckhand on the tug barges on the Mackenzie River. Most of the transportation at that time in the north was done on the Mackenzie. I got a job as a deckhand, and of course I was working with a group of young men my own age who were either Dene, Inuit, or Métis. All were deckhands my own side. And when we would pull into shore, we'd just sit around and talk, and we would talk about much of this. I remember describing this conversation to my wife, and she said, I don't think young male teenagers ever had a serious conversation about anything, but the fact of the matter is we did. And I learned an enormous amount from these young men, all teenagers my own age, all Dene, Inuit, or Métis. So what I would really ask the two of you is to explain the special insight and the relationship of the Dene, the Inuit, and the Métis to the land. And I think specifically, I'd ask you, Tanya, to speak about the land-based bush gallery. And Chantelle, I'm going to ask you after Tanya has spoken to talk about it, your canoe trip, and to talk about the Guardians, who I admire enormously. So over to you, Tanya.
Perfect, thank you. I was realizing we did mention the connection between land and nature in the last question, and I didn't go there, so it's great to get a chance to speak about that. It's really guided my work as an artist, as a curator, as a community member. That relationship, it goes beyond just a descriptive kind of relationship. It's very deep. It's very, spiritually connected. It's a connection to our ancestors. And really importantly, it's a connection to the ecologies around us. The ecologies around us that, on many reserves, because of the lack of development, because of structural inequity, means that we also at times have richer biodiversity in our lands, not in our whole territories, which are of course a very larger component of unceded territories, but talking about just the reserves. And so we have this incredible asset. We have, our community members who still rely on the land for foods. There's so many important models of how deeply we are connected to our lands. And I really feel that everyone can learn from that. And in your example, you're speaking about Dene, Inuit, and others who have special knowledge that comes from a continuum of thousands of years of their ancestors' knowledge bases. And as Chantelle was saying, we're only coming to a point of starting to recognize and affirm those knowledges, outside of those communities now. And there is an incredibly rich sphere of language that is knowledge that is tied to the land, so much incredible work that we have yet to see. And in part, this is also because Indigenous peoples needed to protect that knowledge from ways that it was being extracted from our communities and made to serve other kinds of initiatives or ideas. And so now, with Indigenous peoples in positions to bring their knowledge with them, not for it to be taken and, and studied at the institution, but for us to come with that and come with our communities, now we can start to find ways to share those important teachings and learnings that are often land-based. And I have to also give, we're talking about Dene folks, and I'm going to speak from my perspective, not of course from other Indigenous peoples, but a very inspirational project for me that I had a chance to visit is the Deshinta Center for Research and Learning. And this is a project in Yellowknife where many Indigenous Dene youth are engaged in, both both political and curricular, disciplines we might recognize in Western universities, as well as land-based knowledge. And this idea for me is quite revolutionary, to think about affirming Indigenous knowledge on the same playing field as other kinds of, more Western rational kinds of knowledge. So that's been really instrumental for me thinking about this idea of bush gallery. And bush gallery is something that I do as an artist. It's a collaboration with both other artists as well as with my land. And that's a continuum of me being there on my land. I can recall my great grand uncle who testified at the McKenna McBride Commission. And he said, I don't want to sell my land and I don't want to lose my rights. And that's the same place we are today, 100+ years later, that part of my work is to look at the struggle my ancestors have had for their lands, which is ongoing today, and to, instead of showing work and thinking about art in many different city centers across Canada, which I had a chance to do as a curator and an artist, I wanted to be placed on my land, in my territories, and start to think of that from that center, not from a center, in a gallery in another city, displaced from my community. And so all of that learning that is so attached and integral to the land has been incredibly important for me. It's led me to my CFI research project, Citation Studio, and that's cite as in SITE /ATION. This idea of how we can cite the land and Indigenous communities' knowledge in a way that's commensurate with a text citation. So we're all familiar with, the conventions of citation at university when you're citing another scholar and a text, and importantly, a lineage of knowledge. But for me, I have learned as much through site-specific or citation. And I'll give a quick example, which is I've worked with elder artist and basket maker Dolores Purdaby from the Nisconlith community of Secwépemc Nation. And she mentored me in birch bark basketry. And here you have this incredible artful object, vessel, but it is symbolic of a transformation that requires us to know the land. It requires us to know which side of the tree the bark grows thickest on because it faces the sun versus in the shade. It requires us to know the season to collect it. And importantly, in the way that Dolores teaches and many other Indigenous peoples, it requires us to offer something in exchange for harvesting that material. And that is that simple act of offering and having respect could be a transformative change for everyone. If we had to thank and give an offering for all the old growth trees that we log in BC still today, for all of the resources we pump out of the ground, would that fundamentally change our relationship to be a being who is respecting and in relationship to another being of this, that something we consider a resource, That's a fundamental shift in how we think. So, I'm really taken with this idea of the symbol of the basket, and we might have used it for picking berries or different kind of traditional foods, but I also think of it as this container of ideas and the possibility of transformation. And I also do this work because it fills me with joy. It fills me with joy to learn more about the land. We live in this time of kind of scarcity and thinking of the real scary future of climate change. But I also see that when we can shift, when we can respect, that the land is also abundant and it invites us to be in relationship. And we need to just start to pay attention to that, in my view.
Well, thank you, Tanya. And Chantelle, we now want to hear about this canoe trip. And I'm very interested in what you're going to say about the Guardians.
Well, thank you very much for the question. So as part of this ongoing study that I've been working on with my own community of Biigtigong Nishnaabeg, we have been looking at, describing, exploring, examining ways that our community is reconnecting with our traditional territory. So our, just as a little bit of background, our community has been engaged in a comprehensive land claim for almost as long as I've been born. Okay, so we're going back to the late 70s, and we're now in 2021, and it's not settled. And so we have a massive traditional territory that we're fighting to, you know, maintain our rights through this legal process. But above and beyond that legal process, our community is growing impatient. And we've been searching for ways to assert our rights because we see all sorts of, I would say, encroachment in our territory by mining companies, by cottagers, by logging, you know, over this like 40-year period. And so we recognize the need to establish a canoe journey through the heart of our territory. So the Pic River extends from the mouth of the Lake Superior up to Long Lake. So that's about 100 kilometers. The length of the river had not been canoed for a very long time. And there's all sorts of different, you know, logging roads and so on that has really changed the nature of the way that our community and our community members, who now really live at the mouth of the Pic, are able to engage with, enjoy, connect with the lands and resources of our traditional territory. And so the idea to do this canoe trip came from our chief, Duncan Michano, who's a long time trapper and canoeer and, you know, general guy that you just find out on the land. And so what we did was we created the Canoe Trip, and we paired up young people with older folks, knowledge keepers, people who understood the land, or guardians, and they were dropped off, you know, at the top of the river and made their way down. Before the trip could actually happen, there was a lot of clearing of, you know, passageways and so on, to make sure that it was a safe journey, and to make sure that people could get through. And actually, I mean, it's not really remote, but like you'll lose cell service in there. So you really have to know where you're going. And so they did a lot of work to kind of prepare for the trip in terms of kind of like clearing the land, but also having connections and reestablishing those connections between the elders and the leaders of the trip and the young people. Because we really wanted to, you know, walk the path of our ancestors, or, you know, canoe the path of our ancestors, but also to reclaim the places, reclaim the trees, and reclaim the mountains and the special places along the river, because we are known as, you know, Biigtigong Nishnaabeg is the people of the muddy waters, and that's where we see the water eroding, or sorry, see the mud eroding, right? And our rivers really like dark and clay like that. And so this trip was very important on multiple levels. But what was really special about the trip was the way the young people could sense their ancestors. And I think if we think about the length of time it had been since our old people traveled on that river, and compare it with how long it takes for water to cycle through the atmosphere and come back down, it is possible that they were actually traveling on the same water. And these young people described that like beautiful sense of knowing that their people were with them. And when I say people, I don't just mean, and I shouldn't say people, I mean relatives. They knew their relatives, they understood the land, they could understand the trees, and they could just sense this the whole way through. And so this type of research, like, you know, it is transforming young people. It's reestablishing our connections with places, with sense of identity. And this is so critical for the wellness of people and the wellness of communities. And so not only are we, I think, reconnecting people with really old knowledges, right? And our sacred laws and teachings, because that is what is at the foundation of this work. But we're doing it in a way that brings them into the university and teaching them that they can actually do this work and bring others in. And so I think one of the greatest pieces of my job is that I get to go home and I get to work with my mom. So when Tanya was talking about the joy, one of my very first research grants was actually funded by CIHR, and we created a documentary. And we had young people in Northern Ontario. So our community, Biigtigong and Batchewana First Nation of Ojibways, we trained young people. We brought them down to Western, trained them in qualitative methods and film studies. And then they work with actual filmmakers and filmmakers in training to create a documentary. And my mom apparently is a natural on the camera, and she just was like, being interviewed in my childhood living room, and I could see my engagement photo of my husband behind her, and she was just laughing and singing and like sharing these beautiful stories. And I think that is what we're trying to do, is to reconnect families and our knowledge systems in these original ways. And I just think it's so beautiful. And even though I think we're doing it in very different settings and in contemporary ways, I think the spirit of what we're trying to do remains the same. And I think that is why it's just so important and so beautiful.
Boy, this is great stuff. I could just listen to the two of you all day. I mean, do either of you know, I'm just throwing this in, forgive me, but do either of you know, were the Guardians represented in the Canadian delegation in Glasgow? Do you know? I don't know, and I think we should. I think it's something that really should be followed up on. I'm going to go on now. Both of you, in what you've just said and throughout this piece, you've really adopted an interdisciplinary approach. You come at it from all right that way, and I guess the question is, why have you done so? Because it doesn't always happen, and would you say that it's really important for research today and in the future to do so? Go ahead, Tanya, you go, and then Chantelle.
Sure. Thank you, Chantelle, for your sharing of the canoe journey. It's really wonderful. With this question, I'm reminded of the very important scholar and elder and knowledge keeper who is also at UBC Okanagan, Jeanette Armstrong, who's a Syilx knowledge keeper and elder who is also a full professor, and she's amazing. I'm so lucky to be at UBC Okanagan, where she also works within Indigenous studies. But I remember her talking about pushing for interdisciplinary approaches in research as a way of working that was really more aligned with Indigenous ways of thinking, being, and carrying knowledge that we've always, and I'm speaking broadly here, but there's also specificity in terms of my nation and other diverse nations, but culture and language, ceremony, all these have been also important sites of knowledge. And those are essentially interdisciplinary ways of both absorbing, sharing, and creating knowledge. And so, yeah, it resonates with me when Jeanette Armstrong talks about the importance of interdisciplinary approaches. As an artist, it's just the approach that's quite natural to me. I've always, been interested in the world around me, the socio-political context, my rights and how I assert those and bring other people into those in terms of Indigenous rights. And I do that through art. And I do that also as an artist as a responsive act. So I'm not necessarily always working in one medium like painting or sculpture. I'm also working with different methods depending on the project I'm thinking about or sharing. So with this natural kind of tendency to work with interdisciplinary approaches, both as an artist and as a mixed Indigenous and non-Indigenous background, I do see this as being really important ways of coming at problems in different kinds of ways, right? We've seen lots of exciting artists working with scientists and which has arrived at new kinds of knowledges that maybe wouldn't have come about with a strictly disciplinary approach. So I do think it offers all kinds of potential for arriving at a different method of problem solving. And so I think that interdisciplinary approach can be so important and importantly, I think we must consider it as robust and rigorous, if not also sort of spirited and circuitous at arriving at knowledge. But I think it's really important to see it as a critical space of inquiry that is as robust or rigorous as any other kind of scientific or engineering approach, that it can really allow us to arrive at a different place than a strictly disciplinary approach. So I really think that collaborative way of working across disciplinary borders, that we can continue a line of inquiry and research that in my mind is also a bit of a counterweight to some of the harms that a rationalized Western scientific approach has created, whether intentionally or not. That's perhaps a larger debate. But that interdisciplinary, at the heart of being an artist, I'm deeply interested in collaboration. I think of my collaboration with not only other artists, but community members, non-artists, the land itself. And for me, it offers so much generative space of inquiry that can exceed the kind of perhaps structures and rule systems and borders of disciplines. So it's a transdisciplinary kind of approach, an interdisciplinary approach, I think for me is the way I work. And I think it's an imaginative and potential, it's infused with potential. And for me, it's a really kind of futuristic way, perhaps, to think about working as well, to work in those different kinds of interwoven methods.
I take it you agree with that, Chantelle?
I do agree with that. I think as somebody who's focused on health and the environment, the way that I view interdisciplinary approaches is like essential. We're at this time, I think, where Indigenous health is actually not improving. We continue to see horrible things happening and environmental crises taking place in Indigenous communities, and early death, suicides happening in Indigenous communities, really inequitable health and environmental outcomes happening. And so more research is not going to solve the problem. More money is not going to solve the problem if we're not working together in a good way. So I think that what we need is a more focused, maybe values-based approach that is about listening to communities. So, for a long time, research in health and medical sciences related to Indigenous people was really descriptive. It was okay to publish about disparities and documenting disparities between health, life expectancy or, rates of diabetes between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. And it's not okay to continue doing that work if it's not making a difference for Indigenous people. And I think this is why interdisciplinary approaches are so critical, because they engage with tools and with methods and with theory that help us to understand the roots of inequity from lots of different ways of knowing, right? And ways of approaching the problem. And so I think a lot of times, as a geographer, people are very confused about how it is that I do health research. And I think this is because I'm interested in looking at how processes of environmental change processes of environmental dispossession continue to take place in Indigenous communities and how we can research back on these matters. And so I really think that the most important way of doing really good interdisciplinary work that is going to connect and bring about change is a values-based approach. And that means that we're centering communities, centering matters of like Indigenous communities and their self-determining needs, and putting Indigenous leaders in place around these projects.
If Chantelle, sorry, Roseann?
I was going to say, this is absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
But we might only have time for one more question, Mr. Martin.
Oh, well, okay. Let me just say then, if we ever can come back, I would really like to see us be able to deal with that. And this whole question of the values approach, and to hear from Tanya as well on that. Okay, I'm going to have to cut you, and I really don't want to do that. But Tanya, you've told a story about selling fruit at a powwow and seeing break dancing, and you're bringing to rather traditional and contemporary art. I guess the real question is this the evolution? Is this the evolution of what we're talking about, or are you in the process of creating a new vision?
Yeah, I tend to not think of an evolutionary process because I see it as so the past, the present, and the future is so intertwined, especially when we think of the ways in which we're informed by ancestral wisdom today. So I tend to think of it as a continuum as opposed to an evolution. Evolution sort of presupposes a kind of binary of the past and the present and the future, and I really see that as more interwoven. And so I really tend to think about a continuum of practice. You know, there's so many fantastic Indigenous ancestor artists who are in collections at museums and galleries across this country that are unattributed. So, you know, it may say Secwépemc on an item, it may say Anishinaabe, it may say Mohawk, but we don't know who those makers are who made such incredible, innovative. So though we're talking about the past, beads are not something that existed before interaction with settler communities, or, you know, maybe some were from larger trade, roots, and of course the role of dentalium and other shell-based items used for necklaces and adornment and trade were very important and were existing, you know, before settler contact. But we have these forms, like I can think of, you know, Métis floral beadwork, wool Melton blankets for Coast Salish peoples. Those are contemporary works in that they're using new materials in adaptive and innovative ways. And so, you know, those works, we tend to think of them as works of the past because they are unattributed, they're resting in museums, but those are belongings, those are, you know, ancestor artists who possessed incredible contemporary innovation and adaptation. And I think that's so important to start to think of those very differently. And yeah, in this story you shared, I think it's also important to recognize my auntie, Joyce Willard, who brought me to those powwows. She would run a fruit stand and we would sell fresh fruits at powwows at Kamloops, at Kamloops powwow. And that was such a fantastic experience. And that's why it's important to acknowledge our relatives who brought us into connection with community and culture. And there's this great breakdancing crew coming through. And, you know, in terms of thinking about continuum versus a break with the past or some kind of evolutionary stream, all of the dancers and community members who are at that powwow came out and celebrated with those break dancers. You know, I remember a blanket dance happening after, which was offering money to support these young Indigenous men who were doing this amazing break dance routine. And so, yeah, that was embraced, and many new ideas are always continually embraced. We can look to all of the incredible work that young Indigenous artists and activists are doing in social media. That's a whole other level. Not my generation, the TikTok generation, but I do see incredible work being done there by young people, and think of the futurity of that and how that is deeply connected to those that came before them. And so that idea of continuum is really important to me in how I think through these kinds of practices as an intersection of past, present, and future, as opposed to a hard border between that kind of concept of time.
All right, since we're a little tight for time, I'm going to just hop ahead. I'm going to ask you, Chantelle, and then I'll ask you, Tanya, to comment. But you people have both worked with people from around the world, from the Arctic to Africa, and I've got some notes on what you've done. You've worked the Arctic, Africa, and then Hawaii and Ontario. I got to tell you, I worked Arctic to Africa to Ontario, never in Hawaii. I don't understand how I missed that. Oh gosh, you're lucky. But I really would ask, I think I'd ask the two of you. You first, Chantelle, how does international dialogue, how does the knowledge of what's going on abroad, how does that enrich your outcomes? And how do you handle it?
Great question. I think we are in this time where we're facing environmental crises. We've seen forest fires happening in the Amazon, right? Unprecedented forest fires. I remember I went running this summer, and even though there's not a forest fire for thousands of kilometers away, the sun rose and it was like this deep red color. And so despite the fact that Indigenous peoples live in very different ecologies, we have very different cultures, very different ways of knowing, the threat of environmental change is consistent among us, right? Because we are land-based people. Our ways of knowing, our knowledge systems, our links to our ancestors, our stories, our creation are founded in the land, right? And so what we're trying to do in the work that I'm doing right now, we have a collection of community-based projects. My community, Biigtigong, Iumato, just south of Auckland Airport in New Zealand, or in Aotearoa, and then just at the base of Mauna Kea on the Big Island of Hawaii. And through all of these cases, what we're trying to demonstrate is how Indigenous people stand for their land and why, right? Because I think that if we do not understand the fundamental role that Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous protection and the establishment of Indigenous rights in these places holds, not only for the wellness of Indigenous people, but for all people, then we will be doomed. And so we are taking, I think, a stand that if we can talk about and share the relationality between Indigenous peoples, their ways of knowing, and their wellness, and the ways that it is so firmly planted in the land, that we can share a really good message with all people. And because I think that, these knowledges, these ways of knowing have kept Indigenous people alive for a really long time. I shared yesterday, I was able to visit with my my children's public school, who's being renamed at the moment. And I showed a photo of my grandmother and her sister, who, despite all the efforts of Indian agents and so on to take their children, they were able to save their children. And the only reason that I'm here today and that I'm able to be a part of this conversation is that they practice incredible resilience and strength and courage, and had that foresight. And that makes me really, really proud. And also, I think really, just really happy that I'm able to share these messages. So I think a big part of the the reason that we do this work across nations is because we have similar struggles. And so if we can share our strategies for protecting our places, protecting our people with other nations, with other Indigenous nations, it's going to be, I think, a safer place, a better place for everybody.
Well said. You want to comment on that, Tanya?
Sure, I think Chantelle said so much there. And perhaps I'll just, I think it's important to put things firmly in the reality today too on the ground. And Indigenous peoples are still being criminalized for defending their lands. And for defending their lands, let's be clear here, not just for themselves, but for all of us. For all of us, we need to start thinking about how we are protecting lands and resources in this time of accelerated climate change. And I think my point about continuum is also to see that our ancestors, my great-grandparents also faced a intense and accelerated type of ecological change that was really devastating. People were being fenced out of places. They gathered berries, roots, where they hunted. And that actually continues today. It continues with models of private property and resource extraction, which come into conflict with Indigenous rights. And so these are things we need to think about, in the moment, and we need to start to change the playing field, in my view. And it's my work within artistic practice perhaps uses unconventional means to have those conversations, but I think we're at a time where we need to look to the unconventional, the interdisciplinary, and other modes if we're going to come together and create the kind of shifts I think that our great-grandchildren would like to see us contributing to.
All right. I've got one last question and a comment, and then Roseann's going to kill me. The question is, do you guys? You've now had a whole bunch of questions posed by somebody of a generation that you can't even believe still exists. Would either one of you have a question that you wish had been asked that you would have asked each other?
I mean, I'll just say I'm so affirmed by Chantelle and her work and her responses. In academic institutions, we still face, the fact that we are statistically a very small but potent force. I think at UBC, Vancouver, and Okanagan, Indigenous faculty make about, 2% of the entire, academic faculty. And so it's fantastic to be able to share with Chantelle and all the successes of her work. I perhaps don't have a question, just to be able to express my support for her. It's not always easy for Indigenous faculty within these kinds of spaces, and the ways we're trying to put a foot in the door and hold it open for each other. So thank you so much, Chantelle, for all you've offered and for all the questions and conversation today.
Chantelle?
I will just say the exact same back to you, Tanya Miigwech. I think that you have shared really beautifully, and I think that a big part of what we're trying to do, as you said, to put our foot in the door, right? We're actually trying to address structural change. We're trying to make spaces so that other young people and older people can come in and behind us and see themselves reflected in this place, so that they don't have the same experience that maybe we have. And I mean, it's something that's so recent. Like I've only been an academic for not 20 years, and I feel like I've already seen this massive transition happening. So I just got to say that I'm really honored to share this space with Tanya, and have just appreciated, I think, this really beautiful space to comment really honestly about not only our successes, but also the challenges and the tensions, because they are real and we have to pay attention to them. And I think if there's one final comment, I would be that our universities really need to do the work necessary, and keep paying attention, right? So that building the space for more students and more faculty and staff is really important, but we also have to be making structures that welcome the knowledges and our communities and our children when we bring them into the space, so that we know that we actually do matter and that we actually are welcome.